Welcome to our next panel. It's called Shifting the Burden. It's a right, not a fight. Did I get that right? Or it's not a fight, it's a right. It rhymes. The current NAGPRA regulations have been strongly criticized as creating loopholes and burdens. Does this sound familiar? That the Act and its originators never intended. This presentation will provide case studies and insight on how the regulations can be revised to shift the burden away from Native nations and better implement NAGPRA's purpose of returning ancestors and culture that institutions and agencies have never had the right of possession to. Who will be talking today, and I gotta acknowledge this beautiful picture of Shannon and Sonia Adelaide here on the front. Isn't that a great photo? I can always count on Sonia and Shannon for giving us a good fist bump. So what we're going to talk about is I'm going to talk about a little bit about how NAGPRA was supposed to work when the law was passed in 1990 and what we thought was going to happen. And then Shannon Martin is going to talk about how it did work and give some examples about how it has worked. And then Melanie from the National NAGPRA program, Melanie O'Brien, is going to talk a little bit about how it could work with the hopefully upcoming proposed rulemaking that may present itself at the end of the year. We're not sure. We're going to forego introductions. Hopefully you all know us all by now. If not, in the program there's bios and more information about us. But the three of us have worked and strategized on how we can improve NAGPRA. And it's an ongoing conversation. I will tell you that the National NAGPRA program and Melanie O'Brien has really helped push that program into the future and in support of tribes and museums to work NAGPRA in the way that NAGPRA was intended. And of course, you know Shannon Martin and her long history of advocating for these issues. So let me get started. So how was this supposed to work? And back in the early 80s, NAGPRA wasn't the first, and it's certainly not the only piece of repatriation legislation. The National Museum of the American Indian Act was actually the first repatriation law. And when Native advocates, including the Association on American Indian Affairs, at the time our executive director was Jerry Flute, and his work with Suzanne Schoen-Harjo and Walter Echohawk and others from NARF pulled together to help support how the NMAI institution was going to be transferred over to the Smithsonian. So before it was the NMAI, it was the George Gustav High Museum, the American Indian Museum in New York City. And it was an institution created by this German man, I believe, George Gustav High, who was an avid collector. He would remove railroad car loads full of sacred items, objects, ancestors, and other things, and take them to New York to fill up a collection house full of our items and our people. And out of that one institution, so much of the black market and the items that are now in private collections came from. It became kind of like a trade house where dealers and anthropologists and archaeologists would come and say, hey, I have this, can I have yours? And they would trade, and these items would go all over the world, and they'd go all over the US. So as museums were competing to have the best exhibits, that George Gustav High Museum that is now the National Museum of the American Indian was developed. And So that law, that act, was the first time repatriation was really considered by advocates. And everyone was a little bit scared to add repatriation of human remains. That's what everyone was looking at first, is the repatriation of ancestors. They were scared because SAA and a lot of other museum and institutional representation were saying, no, it's going to clear out all of our collections. What happened was a beautiful coming together of Congress people who had visited some of the institutions, including institutions of the Smithsonian, realizing how many boxes of people were stored in these institutions, finding it deplorable and despicable. They helped to move the NMAI Act forward so that it included those repatriation provisions, and there set the stage for NAGPRA. So when NAGPRA happened and tribal advocates and others were coming together to work on the provisions of the law, what was thought we were creating, I say we, it wasn't me, it was the people that came before me. What they created was a simple administrative procedural act that you would follow for the purpose of repatriation or graves protection, right? So let me go to my notes a little bit. We never gave our cultural items away, right? So one of the most important things that came out of the law of NAGPRA, and I love how Melanie gave me these beautiful United States Codes books. What actually was beautiful and helped to manifest the human rights nature of NAGPRA was this great definition of what is the right of possession. And so if you look in the definitions of the Act, you'll see that it's a beautiful definition, and it basically says an institution or a federal agency, well, first off, you can't have a right of possession to ancestors and their funerary objects first. So there's no excuse from an institution to claim that they have any ownership or legal ownership rights of our ancestors and their funerary objects, now numbering over 100,000, mostly on the culturally unidentifiable list. But mostly all of the other types of cultural items, unassociated funerary objects, objects of cultural patrimony, and sacred objects, that an institution cannot have a right of possession unless they can prove at the time of the removal of that item that they had permission from the authorized representative of that nation to remove that item. How many institutions do you know who, for the most part, can prove that? They can't. They can't, right? Our cultural heritage items, we never gave up the inherent authority over our cultural heritage, nor do museums today have any ownership rights of our cultural heritage. And the law says that. And that right of possession, I think that phrase is so important because it relies on already accepted federal law. It requires, that federal law requires anyone who has Indian property or has taken Indian property, and of course this is a historic older law, that non-Indian person has to prove they have a right to possession, that they obtained that properly, fairly, and with consent. Even though that particular language isn't used, that's essentially what it means. And that right of possession definition came from that older historic law, that the burden is on the non-native to prove that they have a right to that property. So NAGPRA is based in long-standing law protecting our rights to our culture as well as land and other resources. But what ended up happening after 32 years of practice is that we see many institutions still having a hard time either doing NAGPRA whatsoever or working with tribes in an efficient and healthy way to move repatriation efforts forward. So let's talk a little bit more about the Act, and I don't want to take up too much time here, so let me get a little bit quicker. So other things under the Act that need to be taken care of is that museums and federal agencies are required to compile an inventory of the ancestors, right, and funerary objects in their collection. An inventory only required a review of information possessed by the institution. So whatever the institution has in its hands about that collection is all that's needed to determine cultural affiliation under the Act. The Act is not, I very much enjoy when people talk about, well, we want to meet the spirit of NAGPRA. And I never quite understand why people use that, because to me, Congress put the spirit of NAGPRA in the words of the Act. But what ended up happening in practice by institutions who have more leverage and power, because most of the decision-making is in their hands, what ended up happening is a practice of NAGPRA was generated and also reflected in the current regulations that provided some loopholes and wiggle room for museums to confuse that simple administrative process. And what often archaeologists, anthropologists, museum curators, and others have done is, well, if there's any problem or we don't agree on how NAGPRA is practiced, let's go back to the legislative history, because the legislative history, everyone is really proud of the legislative history and the wonderful things that Congress said about NAGPRA and why it was passing the law. But the problem with the legislative history is it's not the law. The legislative history was also said before the final language of the Act was approved and settled and passed. So the terms and the way in which Congress was phrasing things may not always connect up with how the law ended up. So when people have problems with how should we understand the regulations, I tell them, don't go to the legislative history, go to the Act itself. So if we want to take this back to NAGPRA 101, the Act is the thing that Congress passed. The regulations are the thing that the Department of Interior passes with tribal consultation in order to implement the Act. So it may provide more details and structure that the Act doesn't, but it has to follow the Act. Another thing that requires is consultation. Actually, let me go back, and then I want to get Shannon up here to talk about an example and a case study of how the practice of NAGPRA has been working. So if you read the Act itself, it clearly says that based on, and I'm sorry I don't have the actual text to show you right here, but what it says is that an inventory is produced simply with the geography and tribal consultation. So those are the things that you need in order to make a determination of cultural affiliation. You do not need to research. This is not a research project. Though many institutions have put in a lot of money and time and capacity into their NAGPRA infrastructure in order to build in those processes. So you have many ivory tower institutions building these really complex processes and protocols for NAGPRA, and they have actually spent a lot of time and energy, money, and lawyers how to paper those processes so that they can always provide some sort of reasonable question that our consultation and the information and expertise that we put up is less than and can't provide a reasonable basis for affiliation. Or they often use that information to create competing claims between tribes, so then they don't have to repatriate. I think everyone in here may have a particular story of the repatriations that they've worked on, and I want to see from a show of hands, if I can, how many of you all in your NAGPRA practice go back to the law and regulations and see, okay, where am I in the process? How do I understand this process? Or do you rely on the museum and institution to tell you where you're at in the process? So how many people use that law and the regulations as kind of a checklist? There's a few of you. I would definitely recommend that each of us use that, as, especially the law, as a guidepost of how we want NAGPRA to move forward. I know you wanted me to say 10 million other things here, Melanie. So what we thought NAGPRA was going to provide, how we thought NAGPRA was going to work, was a simple administrative process where we worked and consulted with museums and institutions, and based on geographic affiliation. And if you look up, I don't think I can look up right now. If you go to the National NAGPRA website and go to the inventories database and pick out your favorite museum, and stick that museum's name in there and look at how many ancestors are not identifiable or unaffiliated, and how many of those ancestors actually have site locations, county and state site locations. And you'll find that about 97, 98% have that geographic information. And like I said, that and consultation is enough to find affiliation and repatriate even expeditiously within 90 days upon request from a tribe. The problem is that many museums did not actually follow that process for a lot of different reasons and excuses that we still hear today. So let's get on the track of some more concrete examples and then learning more about how we can start shifting the burden and the problems with practicing NAGPRA that have kind of gotten us stuck where we are today, and seeing how we can become more hopeful and motivated to take NAGPRA and hopefully the implementation of new regulations in a new direction. So I want to bring up my sister, Shannon Martin, for our next spot. Yes, ma'am? Okay, thank you. Oh, you're going to stay there? I'll have it for her. Okay.
Yeah, before I begin, I'd like to first acknowledge elders in the room who laid a strong foundation and a clear path for us to follow. So two of my Uncle Clarences over there, Uncle Clarence White, you'd raise your hand there, and Uncle Clarence Surratt. And I also acknowledge my parents, Sidney and George Martin, who have been doing this work since the late 60s and early 70s before the law passed. I also like to acknowledge all of the past and present members of the Michigan and Anishinaabe Cultural Preservation and Repatriation Alliance. See Colleen Medicine, Uncle Dale Anderson. All of these individuals throughout the years collectively put into motion some of the most amazing efforts in Michigan to bring home our ancestors. So our story, in which I'm very honored to be up here to talk about, goes back to about 2003 and 2004. And this particular case study involves the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. And this particular case truly tested our mettle, but it also provided us with a 360 view on how we as tribal people needed to strategize and look inward and find all paths to compel and work with these universities and institutions for the return of our ancestors and their funerary belongings. I began working at the Ojibwe Center in November of 2001, and at that time, I came on board when the team was planning and developing the Ojibwe Center of Anishinaabe Culture and Lifeways, which opened in May of 2004. Our former and founding director, Bonnie Echtel, a member of the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe of Michigan, reluctantly had to set aside some of the files that led up to the planning and design regarding NAGPRA. And she expressed to me she felt bad about that, but we had a long conversation, and words came to me from my parents that said the ancestors will understand. They'll understand that you have to complete this work before picking up that bundle of NAGPRA work again. And so with that, we were able to, in which we had to put all of our time and effort into opening the Ojibwe Center of May of 2004. But as soon as we opened the doors, Bonnie called us together and said, we need to start this work again, because the ancestral work is what birthed the Ojibwe Cultural Society at the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe of Michigan. That nonprofit tribal organization began in 1995 as a direct response to NAGPRA. So we began to look at the number of ancestors and where they were located. And we thought, well, we'll start right here at home. So we began to write a NAGPRA consultation documentation grant, submitted it to the National Park Service. It was awarded to consult with the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And we identified 3 sites that were within the Aboriginal territory of the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe of Michigan. And those sites were the Rivera Voss site, the Young site, and the Bussinger site, totaling 684 minimum number of individuals, ancestors. We spent 2 years compiling our information. And this was really my first experience with consultation with an institution. And it was what I now see a terrible experience. The National Park Service gave us up almost $80,000 to complete this work. That's when we brought on my sister, Dr. Sonia Adelai, as our archaeological consultant. But what we were presented with was one meeting with Dr. John O'Shea at the University of Michigan, his collections manager, and collections assistants. They allowed us one meeting to come and meet with them. The meeting lasted maybe 3 hours. During that time, they selected the associated funerary objects, the ancestors' belongings that they wanted us to look at. And when we reflected on that, we understood that in their selection of these belongings, they were mining us for information, because they were standing around behind us, eavesdropping as we were talking with our spiritual elders and leaders about what we were seeing. And they were writing in their clipboards, taking down notes, and moving about eavesdropping on our conversations. When we asked to go visit the ancestors, which were housed in an off-site facility in the back of the tribal, or not the tribal, but the campus police, U of M Public Safety Building, in their inventory storage area. So they had what are considered the choicest pieces, the ancestors' belongings, nicely housed within the Museum of Anthropology, and then the ancestors were stored at the campus jailhouse. We asked to go visit them. We asked if we could sing to them, to pray to them, to offer tobacco, to smudge them. Our request was denied. They said, you can offer your tobacco outside in front of the campus police office. So that was my first experience with consultation. And it was probably the worst. It was the worst experience. So in that way, I think, in reflecting back on that time, we all learned something. We learned a hard truth that those who are in possession of our ancestors and their funerary belongings completely believed they had power over them and over us. So we needed to strategize about this, and that's exactly what we did as Michigan Tribal NAGPRA representatives, elders, and spiritual leaders. We brought ourselves together in a series of what would be opportunities to identify the way out for these ancestors. And one of our spiritual leaders said, we need to go to those places, feast those places, feast them, because there may be ancestors who are still there that luckily were not unearthed. And that's what we did. We planned a series of days where we would travel to the Bussinger site, to the Rivera Voss site, and to the Young site. We would bring food, we would bring tobacco, and we would bring gifts, and we would sit in those places, those sacred places. We would sing and we would pray. And during those times, we said, "You are not forgotten. We are going to work to bring our relatives home." So that was part of that consultation and documentation grant, that we had to do our own footwork. The University of Michigan offered us nothing. Under Sonia's guidance, she was able to provide us with academic journals, publications, because we as tribal folks, we don't have access to those digital spaces where there are papers and articles published. Some of those spaces are only open to scholars, but she was able to access those places for us and compile the evidence and information we needed to make our case. So we went forward to present a case to culturally affiliate those 3 sites to the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe of Michigan. And before doing that, and during the course of consultation, we consulted with our other sister tribes throughout Michigan and tribes once aboriginal to Michigan, letting them know our intentions, what we wanted to do, and gaining their approval to move forward. So they gave us their approval to move forward. We submitted our request for cultural affiliation in the summer of 2007. We did not hear back from the University of Michigan for about 6 months. In January of 2008, we received a 1.5-page letter from the Associate Provost of Research, I think his name was Dr. Stephen Forrest, that succinctly said, basically said, you are a modern day tribe. We at the University of Michigan do not believe these ancestors are culturally affiliated to you, but we are more than willing to continue discussion regarding these 3 sites. So we were denied our request to culturally affiliate the ancestors. And at this time, it was the end of the grant period. You know, our grant was expiring that year. So it was a fight. It was our right, but we had to fight. And as Michigan tribal folks, we're not afraid to confront and not afraid to back down. So we staged a protest in front of the administration building at the University of Michigan. And we were able to carve out 5 minutes of regent time during their public commentary session. We worked, many minds and eyes worked on a statement. It was rehearsed. And Joseph Somick from the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe of Michigan was designated as the gentleman to read the statement to the regents. When we gathered in front of the regents building, students and faculty and staff who were in support of our efforts gathered, not only from the University of Michigan, but from Eastern Michigan University, Michigan State University, just people came to support and stand in solidarity with the Michigan tribes and with the Saginaw Chippewa. One collective prayer took place, and that prayer was, if we can reach the heart and mind of one regent to make a difference, then we did our job here today. And that's what happened. One regent was appalled that the University of Michigan was so out of compliance, and with the number of ancestors they held within their collections, and did not initiate any form of consultation with tribes across this country. She was appalled, and she began to ask for an internal investigation. And that was the pivotal moment that took place. So in that moment, there was traction within the University of Michigan, supporters, faculty, and staff. Dr. David Mitchner is here. He works for the Matai Botanical Gardens, one of the leaders at Matai. He and others were working internally within the University of Michigan to effect change and to push the agenda to investigate what was happening, while tribes and others across the country were applying external support. So that was our first experience as Michigan tribes, and it truly, it did. It tested our resilience, it tested our mettle, but what it did was instill a fierceness in all of us that we were not gonna stop, that we needed to keep pushing forward and to use the law as a tool in moving forward. You know, my mom, Sydney, always reminded us at every strategy and NAGPRA meeting, and she always reminded those sitting across the table from us in consultations that followed the University of Michigan experience. She'd look at them and say simply, follow the law. It's a law, you're supposed to follow it. It's that simple. But we know, as repatriators, it's never that simple, especially with some of the bad actor institutions and museums across this country. And that leads us to the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology. For without the experience of the University of Michigan, and without us looking at a 360 degree at every case, which we had to do, we had to strategize and look at every institution. Some were easier to work with than others by far, but we knew we were gonna have a tough road to hoe with the Peabody. So we applied for another consultation and documentation grant, which we were awarded. And in that grant, funding was provided to 5 authorized transfer recipient tribes that stood up and took the lead and said, yes, these ancestors were unearthed from our ancestral territory. We will take the lead. So the Saginaw Chippewas submitted the grant on behalf of the Gun Lake tribe, Machi Benashi Wishbanda Pottawatomi, the Nottawasipi Huron Band of Pottawatomi, the Pokagon Band of Pottawatomi, and the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians. So as a collective, knowing that we would prevail and be the authorized transfer recipient tribes, we spent 2 years compelling the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology to give us back our 98 ancestors and all of their funerary belongings. And we submitted a joint request for disposition. Peabody was part of a joint request of all the 12 federally recognized tribes in Michigan and the 2 state historic tribes of Michigan, with the support of the 51 tribes across the country once Aboriginal to Michigan. We submitted these letters to 18 museums and institutions nationally. Peabody was one, but we knew the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology was going to be our toughest adversary, and that's why we wrote the grant. Harvard, Harvard Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology. And we knew this would be tough because we spoke to other tribes across the country who had been denied their ancestors, either culturally affiliated or culturally unidentifiable over the years. And I want to acknowledge the Mashpee Wampanoag and the Nipmuc relatives who spoke with us about their challenges and about their frustration in being denied their ancestors from the Peabody. And one moment that I remember, and this was at a NAGPRA Review Committee meeting that was hosted by UMass Amherst. Shannon was serving on the National Review Committee, as well as Sonia. And one of the TIPOs from the Mashpee Wampanoag by the name of Ramona Peters spoke passionately to the review committee about the denial of ancestors to those eastern tribes, because they collectively requested repatriation from Harvard's Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology. And what she illuminated was that one ancestor was culturally affiliated by the Peabody, Robert S. Peabody Institute of Archaeology, from the same site that they had requested from the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology. So even within this system, one arm said, yes, we're going to affiliate, while the other denied, and they were from the same site. So that's what prompted us that we needed to take a different strategy, a more forceful strategy with the Peabody, and that's exactly what we did as Michigan tribes. So in that work, we compiled what the Peabody called a tome. We took charge of the consultation meeting, and we delivered this tome to then Director Jeffrey Quilter, Patricia Capone, Sandra Dong, and their curatorial assistants. We had copies for all of them. We even brought copies, extra copies, if they needed one. But what we did was we took charge of the consultation. We walked them through chapter by chapter of our evidence, our claim, and our right to bring these ancestors home. The toughest part of that consultation was we understood that in the spirit of NAGPRA law and the spirit of the 10.11 rule, in which we requested, which is the culturally identifiable human remains rule, that the funerary belongings did not have to go home. The law did not specifically say you have to send the belongings home. With every other institution and museum across the country, they complied in the spirit of the law and allowed those funerary belongings to go home with the ancestors under the 10.11 rule. Harvard's Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology kept the funerary belongings. They released our 98 ancestors, but they kept the belongings. So on our way home from repatriating them, the Saginaw Chippewa community spent 2 days to make funerary belongings for our ancestors. So we were able to recommit them with something. But again, that leads us to what could be better, and understanding that to rectify these wrongs is still harm to our communities, because when these funerary belongings are eventually released, the communities, the 5 tribes I mentioned, are going to have to reopen the earth as close to those ancestors as possible and rebury those belongings, which is harm, and it comes with a lot of burden to the tribes.
Did you want to show some of your pictures?
Oh, yeah.
You want to say anything?
Yeah, so this is one of the transfer signings with the University of Michigan. As you can see, Dr. Ben Secunda, Amadeus Scott. We're part of the new wave of change at the University of Michigan, and now things have been moving right along with clearing our ancestors from the shelves at the University of Michigan under their leadership. This is when we visited a site visit to the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology. This is the transfer, authorized transfer recipient signing with former director Jeffrey Quilter to the 5 tribes. The next image is what we captured here in Journeys to Complete the Work, the comic book that talks about those 2 cases that I just shared. And these are renditions of some of the funerary objects that the community came together to make for the ancestors from Harvard. And now we move to how it could work.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you for this opportunity. I never get to tell the fun part, the happy part, the positive part. And it's, I can't tell you what a relief it is to me to be able to talk, hopefully. You know, I've lived these stories. You know, the Saginaw Chippewa story in particular is very close to my heart, and I carry it with me in all that I do. I don't carry the tome with me. I have a copy of that too. I leave it in my office. But it's a real privilege to be able to share with you some of my thoughts about how this could work. And you know, I need to say at this point, these are my thoughts, but really I'm reflecting the thoughts and hopes of the Department of the Interior. This is actually some information we shared last summer during tribal consultation on proposed changes to the regulations. And it outlines really what I think are 3 main issues and that were clearly highlighted by Shannon Martin's presentation in particular. In the existing regulatory framework, there is a burden on the Indian tribes and NHOs to start the process. Museums don't have to do anything, museums or federal agencies, until a tribe makes a request. And as Shannon Martin clearly illustrated, tribal consultation is not always referenced in the decision-making process under the existing framework. As you all know, culturally unidentifiable human remains, that term alone can inhibit and prevent repatriation. And then again, as the Saginaw Chippewa experience clearly illustrates, associated funerary objects can be retained. So in proposing changes to these regulations, the Department of the Interior really wants to shift the burden and shift the way this process works. so that it would require museums and federal agencies to initiate the process, to use consultation to inform their decision-making. Instead of the use of culturally unidentifiable, we propose to use a term geographical affiliation that acknowledges a connection to present-day Indian tribes through Aboriginal land. And lastly, a change in the proposed regulations would require that all associated funerary objects be repatriated and remove the incentive to identify human remains as culturally unidentifiable. The incentive here is if you have culturally unidentifiable human remains, under the current regulatory framework, you can retain the funerary objects. Shannon's example is on point with this, about how at the University of Michigan, the human remains were stored separate from the funerary objects. The funerary objects, in many cases, are the privileged items that museums have kept in displays and storage separate from the human remains. And there's a clear incentive for museums to identify human remains as culturally unidentifiable so that they can retain those funerary objects. We hope to remove that incentive. So here's my projected timeline of how this could work. All dates are flexible. We are talking about the federal government. But the years may be flexible, but the days are definitely what we're going to propose. And that is, day one is a publication of a final rule. So if you recall yesterday, I talked through the process. There's a proposed rule, comments, final rule. When we get to that day of final rule, that's day one. On day 30, that regulation becomes law. It is effective. It has full force of law. And that is the day that museums and federal agencies must start initiating consultation on all human remains in their collections. Over the course of the next 2 years, museums and federal agencies would be required to conduct consultation and update their inventories for all Native American human remains and associated funerary objects. On day 760, which is 2 years plus 30 days, because again, the federal government, museums and federal agencies would be required to submit an updated inventory that identifies both cultural and geographical affiliation, again, of all Native American human remains and associated funerary objects. On day 940, museums and federal agencies would be required to submit notices of inventory completion. Again, notices of inventory completion that identify cultural and geographical affiliation based on consultation. And then on day 970, that's the first day that repatriation statements could be sent if there is a request by Indian tribes or NHOs for those collections. What I think people forget about the process, the way that it was supposed to work, is that museums were supposed to take their information, pull it together, consult on it, publish a notice, and then tribes were supposed to make requests. So that's what we're trying to get back to, where museums and federal agencies are required to pull together their information, identify who has a right to those collections by publishing a notice, and then allow for tribes to come forward and make requests. You can see at the top of my timeline that Indian tribes and NHOs, at their discretion, may make a request to consult and a request for repatriation. Those are discretionary acts on the part of tribes. This is an attempt to reset the process, really how Congress initially intended it to work. If you were here yesterday, you saw my latest numbers of where we're at in terms of the work that's left to be done. And this is, again, I guess just and echo that this is how it must work. We've got to move this process forward. As Shannon rightly said, we're kind of stuck in a space right now where there is movement. I'm glad to say that we're seeing more and more repatriations all the time. There's still a lot of repatriation work to do. And so how do we get it to work like this in my hopeful, pretty picture way? The first is, if you represent a tribe, please participate in tribal consultation on the proposed regulations once they're published. Encourage your tribal leadership and administration to consult. Any person, whether you're attached to a university or not, as your own personal person, you're welcome to comment on the proposed regulations. Please do so. Please tell us what you think we got right and what needs improvement. We want to hear both of those things on our proposal to change these regulations. And then, as we talked a little bit yesterday, I would really encourage tribes, as well as museums and federal agencies, to start now in developing your own protocols for consultation, cultural affiliation, and geographic connections. Start now laying out what that will look like for you and the work that you do, whether that's for tribes and how you're going to make requests, or if that's for museums and how you're going to offer those collections to tribes. In one way, we are hoping to help you with this, at least on the tribal side. Within the next couple of weeks, my office will be sending out inventory lists to Indian tribes based on geographic location. So, you know, our data with the map, we've put that into a spreadsheet. We've identified tribes generally that have an interest in those areas, and we'll be sharing that inventory data, the raw data, with tribal nations directly. Again, in an attempt to give you information that we have that's readily available and that there's no restriction on us sharing, but we have it, so why not share it? Not unlike COVID. We don't want to share COVID, but we want to share this information with you. And so we're going to do that. So look, if you're with a tribe, please look for an email from the National NAGPRA program in the coming weeks that will give you really all of the information we have in our inventory that we think you might have an interest in. And that's all I had. I think we'd like to take questions. And I don't know if we want to start with any questions between us.
Well, I had a question for Shannon. I really wanted to know what this cost you with the Harvard Peabody, that tome you were talking about. What did it cost you to create that and make all those copies, and the time and other resources?
Cost Sonia hours and hours of archaeological research, compiling her notes from multiple consultations, as well as pouring through, you know, the field notes and files from Harvard, which I must say, those field notes and files we had to pay for through the NAGPRA consultation documentation grant. That didn't come freely. From them. We had to request, and then they provided us with a bill of sale.
Wait, Harvard charged you for the information they're supposed to share with you legally under NAGPRA?
Yes.
Okay, just wanted to.
Yes. So they charged us to make photocopies of all of those files, in which we covered through the consultation documentation grant. So it took many hours for Sonia to write our 10-page opinion with citations and with a bibliography. We also spent many hours as a Michigan tribal collective to pour over the inventory itself, as well as to put together information regarding our own oral history, from our various tribes. So all of that work contributed to, the abundance of information and response that we gave back to Harvard for the 10.11, under the 10.11 rule to bring our ancestors home. And in doing that, it was a difficult decision for us in sending out the 18 letters of joint disposition under the 10.11 rule. Leading up to that point, took many meetings and hours for the tribal elders, the leaders, the NAGPRA officers to decide that this was the most efficient way to bring our ancestors home. Because we were met with the University of Michigan denial, and we understood that it takes years and years and years sometimes to culturally affiliate ancestors. And despite the stacks of information and oral history and the compelling evidence that you may present to an institution, they still make the decision whether to culturally affiliate or not. So we decided to utilize the 10.11 rule and bring our ancestors home as expeditiously as we could.
Please come forward to the microphones if you have questions.
Hello. Thank you so much, panelists, for this presentation. My name is Zach Garrett. I work at the University of Tennessee, and we're trying to get all of the ancestors we hold home. I had a question about, I'm really glad Shannon pointed out that all that is needed to establish cultural affiliation is geographic information and tribal consultation. I think that's a really good strategy for tribes and Native nations to return ancestors that museums would maybe try to say, oh, that's culturally unidentifiable, but we know that's not the case. But I was just wondering, especially with the proposed changes, if there's an institution or museum that is, trying to stop repatriation from happening, God forbid, if a tribe comes forward and says, we'll do it through CUI. That's how we can get the ancestors home. But there are examples, where the Aboriginal land is identified through oral tradition, not through a treaty or through the Indian Claims Commission, which are the two sources that the law identifies as, establishing what is Aboriginal land. So I was just wondering if the new changes, if there's anything else that can help Native nations to reclaim those ancestors where the museum might pivot one way or the other. Does that make sense? I mean, I know I'm rambling a little bit here, but.
I'll go real quick. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. If you're working with a historically and contemporarily retentive institution, so this is for all the repatriators out there, despite any new rules or amendments to the law, they are going to work hard to find a way to stop or to slow down your progress. I mean, we experienced this with Harvard's Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology. The first day that we arrived on our second consultation after we presented all of our evidence, Patricia Capone said to us, this was before lunch, even on the first day of a 3-day consultation. I don't know for verbatim, but basically, I don't know if we can quite move forward with the Michigan tribe's request, because what if there is a tribe in the future that becomes state or federally recognized? How can we release the ancestors to all of you if there is some fairy tale tribe that crops up in 2 or 3 years? So as Michigan tribal representatives, we sat there and we looked at each other. I think Sonia's jaw dropped to the table. And we knew at that time we had to strategize that night because we were presented with a Harvard position that despite everything you've done the last 2 years, despite this evidence you presented to us for, the repatriation of your ancestors under the 10.11 rule, they were basically saying, we have consulted with our attorneys and we're just we're not as confident and comfortable to repatriate because there may be a tribe that crops up who could have claim to these ancestors. So we went back to our hotel room after traveling for the last 2 days. We called then Madam DFO Sherry Hutt at 10 o'clock at night for her opinion. Luckily, she typed this up, her opinion, and emailed it to Sonia, and we dropped that in front of them the next morning. So that's, even when you get to the 11th hour and you're confident consultation is going to swing in your favor, some of the most retentive institutions and people will try to roadblock you once again.
So maybe I'll talk about how it could work. Shannon, I don't know if you wanted to say how it's supposed to work.
Right. So the law is such a beautiful thing. I'm sorry, I'm a nerd, I'm a lawyer. It really is a very simple thing. What you don't understand, even about the current regulations, and knowing that the federal process to propose and finalize this new rule, we don't know when that's going to happen, right? We don't know for sure. We're hoping that by 2023 or that things will be rolling in a new direction, but it may not. So regardless, right now we're still under the current law and the current regulations, and so no one should be waiting for the new regulations to come forward to continue to proceed with repatriation and consultation. The bottom line is that many institutions and individuals who are helping institutions develop these positions spend a lot of time and money to not consult, and they will always be there until we hold them accountable for their actions. So I think regardless, unfortunately, regardless of how wonderful the law is and how simple the process could be, and we see that from other institutions who have stated that their process is about repatriation. It's not a research project to affiliate, which is exactly what the law is trying to do, just have a simple process, right? Sorry, I think I'm finding myself getting tired, and I think I'm rambling a little bit. I apologize.
So, why don't I just step in then? And
yeah, step in, please.
So, one way that we've tried to address this in the changes to the regulations, and again, everything I'm saying you can find in the draft proposal that we issued last summer. But what we've proposed is that in updating an inventory, a museum or federal agency has to make a decision, as they've always had to do. They have to make a decision about whether there's cultural affiliation, one, whether there is a geographic affiliation, Aboriginal land, and if there is no connection to a present-day Indian tribe, they have to say why they could not identify that. So our hope is in that forcing institutions to pick 1, 2, or 3, and then if it's 3, say why, it's going to provide the information that tribes need to come back and say, no, here's our tome, here's why it's affiliated, either geographic or cultural.
Thank you, Melanie, and all of you. I appreciate it. Fortunately, our institution is happy to culturally affiliate or go through CUI. However, tribes want to do it, but I know that, not every institution is the same. So I was concerned about that. Obviously, I'm not alone in that. But I appreciate the answers, and I'm hopeful about those new regulations. But as Shannon was saying, we don't have to wait. We can do it now. But thank you for your answer.
Hi, could I follow up on that? I think it would be helpful if you clarified the difference between consultation with an institution for purposes of repatriation and consultation as part of rulemaking that the federal government does, because the weight that tribes have in the rulemaking process for federal regulation is very different than consultation with institutions for repatriation. And I think that distinction needs to be made.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for bringing this up. The federal government, as most of you know, has a nation-to-nation responsibility with sovereign Indian tribes. And for purposes of NAGPRA, that includes Native Hawaiian communities as well. And so that means that the government, the federal government, must conduct consultation at the highest levels between the federal government decision makers. In this case, it's the Assistant Secretary, two of them, who conduct that consultation with Indian tribes and the Native Hawaiian community on changes to these regulations. And as I mentioned, that consultation, the initial consultation on a draft proposal occurred last summer. There will be additional consultation between the assistant secretaries and tribal nations on the proposed rule. And at this point, the assistant secretaries have told tribal nations directly that the Department of the Interior will be incorporating tribal input to the maximum extent possible. So wherever possible, the tribal input that has been received and that will be received will be incorporated into what becomes a final rule.
And to add just a little bit, I want to let you all know that those regulations are going through various processes in the executive branch of the government, and I believe they're at OMB right now. Is that correct?
Actually, you can find this on the website, on the OMB website. OMB concluded its review on September 27th.
And there were institutions and the SAA that provided comments and notes to the OMB saying that the new regulations would be very costly and prohibitive for museums. So I urge us all to be active advocates to make sure these regulations, the regulations that we need, get passed, and that we have robust conversations about these.
I just had a comment. Again, my name is Roshan Downs. I'm from the Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe. And I wanted to just bring up some terms as we talk about how NAGPRA is intended, how it's implemented. And so when you look at tribes, every tribe is unique. We know that. The same goes with the institutions. You know, one of the problems that our tribe had is that we had institutions enticing competing claims. So when you look at that, well, if another tribe comes, we want to make sure we include everyone. That's instigation of competing claims to prevent repatriation. The other term that I heard a lot was called, NAGPRA was compromise legislation. Never has the tribes ever said, we're gonna, share our ancestors and we're gonna, deal them out like cards. And, you keep some, we'll give some back. And so when you look at those inventories, and I just looked it up, I haven't looked at the inventories in a while, so as I was sitting here, I pulled up the Park Service inventory, and I know that you mentioned you're gonna send out notices to the tribes, but I just looked and they're not even close to complete, even in my own state. Even the university that I work for, I know there's a number, and the number that's on the website is not even close. So going to the tribes and saying, here's our inventory, there's 100,000 that need to come back. Just looking at that, I know that that is not even remotely close to being correct. And then finally, my last thought is that the term present-day Indian, with the Spirit Cave, for instance, BLM determined after all the work that the tribe did, getting our reports, getting all of the documentation that we needed to prove that our ancestor, who's a rock throw away from our reservation, with all of the same items we still make, rabbit skin blanket, tule mats. He's native, but not affiliated with any modern day tribe. And so wanting to do genetics, which as we heard today, genetics cannot prove tribal affiliation. So I just want to make the comment that, I know what the intent of NAGPRA is, and I know that it is human rights legislation. And I really hope that all the institutions in here and everyone listening out there, that they remember that and, get those ancestors back to the tribes. Thank you.
Miigwech Roshan, I want to amplify your first point, and to the tribal folks in the audience, what I've witnessed, maybe the past 4 or 5 years, is that there have been institutions who have received consultation documentation grants who have extensive collections. And what they are doing is offering consultation events. So as you're right, as tribal people, I would encourage you to reach out to them and schedule your own individual consultation as a tribal representative from your tribe. Because I experienced being in a room full of folks from all over the country at one of these consultation events, and it was nothing but, Roshan mentioned, an opportunity to create divisiveness and infighting between tribal people. So it's like they're putting us in a cage match, which is unfortunate. And I just want to encourage you all to consult on your own time and ask for your own time with some of these institutions that have been reluctant and who have been retentive over the years.
New York State Museum was one of those institutions that held a big consultation and say, look at our inventory, see, here's all the ancestors that we have. Okay, thanks. So it was like you said, it was a big meeting, everyone came together, peripheral information was made, and then that was it. And those inventories got sent and marked all unidentifiable ancestors. So that's been the extent of some consultation that has happened to get us where we are today. But I really want to address this issue of compromise and this balancing of interests sometimes.
I was going to say, are you going to use the B word, Shannon?
I know, I've been trying to put it to rest, but museums and institutions are still using that because why? It's in the legislative history. It's in the legislative history talking about how the language of this human rights law got passed. And those words and the language that was developed to create that work of art, if you're that kind of nerd, was created through compromise. It was created through discussion and a lot of back and forth between Native advocates and institutions, right? And it created that law. It didn't create a compromise that we had to compromise with the law. The law has no compromise in it. The law is a process to get us to repatriation. There's no balancing of interest test in there. And Congress knows about that because that's kind of a regular thing that you see in case law and in legislative acts where sides have to balance interests in order to come to a resolution or find out who has the stronger interest. There's nothing like that in either the act or the regulations. So there's nothing that you need to compromise. And in fact, think about it. How do you compromise human rights with What are the other interests? What are the museum interests? Research, science, money, those kind of things that are more profit and market-driven, actually. So if anyone ever tells you that it's about compromise and we have to find a balance of interest here, you can tell them Shannon said to go to hell. Well, don't, that's probably not the right thing to say.
Do we have time for another?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Glass. Some of you may remember me from NAGPRA grants. And now I work for the Institute of Museum and Library Services, also doing grants. So my question is going to go back towards some of the things that have been brought up here with consultation and documentation grants. Shannon, you mentioned the time and resources it takes to do this work is often used as, you know, a delay tactic or a, you know, and my question is for the reset, for moving forward, who's paying for this? How is this work going to get done in the next few years and not just used as a delay tactic again? And also, along with that, like Shannon, your example of you guys had to go get these grants to pay for this work and do it yourselves. And our agency's been in a lot of discussions about, well, how can we support this? How can we fund this? And I want to think about both sides of things because asking tribes to come compete for grant money to do this work feels like putting more of the burden back on tribes. And so I'm raising this question from my money perspective, because I would love all three of your advice or input on how can we best support this work moving forward, anticipating these new regs. And I love feedback from anyone in here, too, that has ideas.
Yeah, because the grant process always, it also creates kind of an industry.
Exactly.
And instead of actually doing the work that the law requires, which should be simple, it makes it into a research project.
It funds salaries, it funds staff time.
Exactly.
It's prestigious to get grants, right?
Yeah.
So.
It creates an industry that was never here before NAGPRA, though institutions have been enjoying the benefit of these collections through their exhibits, through the dollars that they get from donors. Academic institutions get the power of being able to share their research collections with their graduate and doctoral community to do research and studies off of. It's an industry, right? So how do you make sure that the process that is getting the funding is actually following the simplicity, hopefully, of the law instead of creating more? I don't know what the answer looks like. That's the grant process.
Well, we've been fortunate over the last year, a couple of years, to have a teeny tiny increase in our grant funding. You know, I would hope that perhaps additional grant funding may be made available, but that's for Congress to decide. I think we talk a lot about the costs of this work. And I know that many of you have been involved with this work for 30 plus years, and you know how much it has cost your tribe, museum, agency to conduct this work. What we're trying to reset is not only the requirements, but really the expectation. You know, in 1990, the Congressional Budget Office looked at NAGPRA before it was passed and had estimates for how much it would cost. Those estimates were only over 5 years because that's what the law required, work to be done in 5 years and 6 months. The Congressional Budget Office said if more was required by the law, it would cost more, but it's not required, so it's not going to cost more. And that's what we're trying to reset We're trying to get back to that place where museums and federal agencies can use the information they have to make decisions and move forward. And my hope would be, again, I'm so happy that I'm getting to be the hopeful, future-looking person today. My hope would be that in 2 years and 6 months after that final rule, NAGPRA grants are being used by tribes to repatriate. That all of that money goes to Indian tribes, either through a museum or directly, not to build cultural affiliation studies, not to fight, but to rebury.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
I have a question and a comment. I didn't bring my eagle feather this time, so I'm not going to harangue anybody. I usually use the eagle feather to keep me calm. My question is that, now to my understanding, I don't know if the law has changed, but when we talk about we've talked about museums that are federally funded, right, and institutions that are federally funded. Now, that does not include museums that are privately owned. They're not involved in this NAGPRA thing, am I right?
The Smithsonian institutions have their own act. That's the NMAI Act I was speaking of. Federal agencies are supposed to comply with NAGPRA, so all the DOI departments and throughout the federal government, except for the Smithsonian institutions.
Except for the Smithsonian. So let's say if there's a museum out there in some state that don't get any funds from the federal government, right? So what I'm saying is that those museums, if they're privately owned or whatever, and they don't get funds, they are not affected by this NAGPRA law, right?
In general, the answer is yes, but federal funds can come in lots of different packages.
Okay, all right. Now, a comment I have is that I'm always amazed about our women and how strong they are, not only in Pokagon land here, but I'm talking about in all Native nations. Conferences I go to and things like that, I mean, the women they're the ones just speaking all the time. And I said, where's the men? We might have maybe 1, 2, or 3 men, but I see that the women up there, and there's nothing wrong with that. Matter of fact, it makes me proud that our women are speaking for our people. Because to me, in my heart, it makes me believe that they are life givers, which they are, but they are family oriented. And by being that way, being community oriented, I see the strength in not only you, but other organizations that the women are involved in. And that makes me happy, it makes me very proud, because we have such strong women in our communities and in our tribes and whatever. And you guys up there, Shannon, Martin, I've been watching you for a long time. And me, what I feel, you're one of those women that I admire quite a lot. And I know that your mother and father raised you, because me and your father talked about you many times. And I'm very proud of you. Proud of your sister Pumpkin, too. She's a warrior, too. Just as I'm proud about this woman over here, Andy Jackson. She's always up front, and she pulls no punches. So I am proud of you guys here and other organizations where our women are involved. And I don't see the men all the time, but I imagine there are some men back there someplace. Okay? I want to give you guys big kudos. I'm very proud of you. And we need to applaud these women of our nation. Oh.
Yeah, my grandmother used to tell me we walk behind the men so we can tell them where to go.
Frank. Well, I have a question, and I know that whenever regulations are being either promulgated in the first place or changes are, and I remember you mentioning that when these come up for comment, to be sure that we make comments about them. But I'm wondering, where's the pushback on these? In other words, who is there pushback to these changes? Because we're talking about them as if they're going to just happen. But having been through several different cases of federal regulations and the work on them, I know that it's never so easy as just to say, hey, this is the way it ought to be, and everybody says, cool. It's usually a fight of some sort. And I just wonder where we anticipate that we're going to have any pushback, if there is any, and if you've given any thought to that, what we need to look out for, because that might help us in how we craft our comments when it comes time to dealing with the public comment period on these as they move forward. Thank you.
All right. Did you want to?
I mean, I can do a little. Thank you, Frank. It's good to see you. I think that anybody who understands the world in which federal regulations are created and born knows how difficult it is, and it is, maybe that's why it's women's work. It is a birthing process for sure. It's not pretty. I think that, of course, we always anticipate opposition, as of course we anticipated we got opposition during tribal consultation last summer, as we knew we would, and we appreciated, because that only makes this better when we have opposition and we can respond directly to it. So I, for one, am looking forward to figuring out who's going to fight this, so that I can respond to them directly and poignantly. I think that, a big issue is the timing. I know already 2 years and 6 months is not long enough when it's been 32 years and this hasn't been done. How on earth are we going to get it done in 2 years and 6 months? That's going to be an opposition. We can't possibly do it in that time without hiring hundreds of thousands of people to do this work. That's going to be an opposition. Part of my job is to anticipate the opposition and to prepare my leadership for who's going to be upset with this. And so that's a lot of the work that I've been doing recently. And I know that there'll be opposition from some people who just don't want change. I mean, it is the way it is, and change is scary to a lot of people, and that's going to be wrapped up in a lot of the arguments against it. I know that Indian tribes and the Native Hawaiian community are going to be disappointed with some of the proposed changes, because there are limits to what can be done. Even yesterday during my presentation, request to give more teeth, to have more binding authority behind the review committee. Those are things that, even if I wanted them to happen, could not happen. The secretary couldn't make them happen. The law has a limit. It has a framework that we have to work within. I think that changes to the regulations are going to disrupt the existing power dynamic. And nobody's gonna, the people who are not in power are gonna like that. But when you look at the example of Shannon and the Saginaw and those fights to reclaim the ancestors, Shannon said there was a power dynamic there. And as much as possible, the regulations are hopefully going to at least try to impact that. Museums and federal agencies will always be the decision makers. That's the way the law is written. But like I said in reference to Zach's question, what if they have to explain why they can't identify a tribe. That we're hopeful that that's going to impact the power dynamic by forcing museums and federal agencies to say why. You know, we're hopeful that we will get opposition because, frankly, I feel like I'm never doing my job unless everybody's mad at me. And I mean everybody. Like, that means I'm in the right space. So, you know, we fully expect opposition from lots of different directions. But that's okay. That's what the process is built for. It's not easy, but it works when you have, when you can move through a process and when there is support within the larger administration of the federal government to move this forward. This regulation is a policy-driven process in large part. So you have to recognize that that there'll be issues that might come up, and the leadership within the Department of the Interior are the ones who are going to make decisions about that.
I just wanted to let you know, we had comments on the Zoom, so I just sent them the contact information for you guys to get into touch with them later because there were so many. Okay.
Oh my. Well, let me just say, let me just make a call to action right now in response to that question. What we would love to see from not just tribes, but from the institutions that have been working successfully with tribes. We want to hear from you talking about your support with tribes on these new regulations. We want to hear from you what the cost is when you do NAGPRA in the way the law requires versus when you do NAGPRA as a research project and spend umpteen $1 million time and capacity hours to create a CUI inventory. So we, the Association on American Indian Affairs, you're going to be hearing from us, and we're going to be asking your institutions to help support support tribal nations and the shifting of the burden that new regulations can give us. Yes. Are we out of time? Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Sorry. Ha matakiapi, Donna Christiani machiapi kishto, Iuha chante western ape chisapi. Hi, I'm Donna Christian. I'm Sichangu Lakota and Dene. And I first want to say that I'm talking before my elders, so I apologize for that. But I do have some questions. I am putting on my legal hat, and there I'm looking at myself, but so I do nerd out over that too. I work in the legal field. But I do have some questions in regard to the language in the proposed changes, only because I don't have them, so I just have questions about that. I know that consultation has come up repeatedly, right, yesterday and today. So because there isn't a definition that exists either in the law or is it being proposed in the changes, a definition of consultation, and then not just tribal, but both sides of what that consultation means, from the nation-to-nation agreement, in addition to the consultation that exists within NAGPRA. And with that, is there a time frame for this consultation with tribal nations and with these museums so that it doesn't take years in order for them to come to a decision?
Sure. So yes, there's a proposed definition of consultation that is drawn from the legislative history for NAGPRA. And that's what was in the initial proposal that we presented last summer. And we received quite a bit of comment from Indian tribes, as you can imagine, on that definition for consultation. So we will be proposing to define consultation. It will be limited to consultation under NAGPRA. Meaning consultation between Indian tribes and museums or federal agencies. It will not necessarily equate to nation-to-nation consultation that we've talked about in the rulemaking setting. It will not necessarily it won't take over any other policies around consultation that federal agencies might be required to follow. So federal agencies are probably still going to have other consultation requirements that the NAGPRA definition alone won't cover. But we're hopeful that at least having a definition for within the NAGPRA context, what does it mean to consult, will help everybody to move forward. In terms of a timeline, as I showed in that slide, we do have a timeline of 2 years for museums to initiate consultation and then respond to any requests that they receive. But again, if a tribe chooses to consult, that's on the tribe. They can do so. They are not required to do so. But by the end of that 2-year period, the museum must update its inventory, at least for the human remains, and complete the process. So again, in hopes that it won't go on indefinitely.
Right, so that 2 years starts at the day of the final or the 30 days past that?
It's the 30 days past.
Okay.
That's where we get 760 days.
Okay. My second part of my questions are the penalties. Is that addressed in the proposed changes as well? Are there going to be, I guess, like deeper penalties, and how enforceable are they? And then if there are fines associated with the penalties, where do the monies go to with those fines?
Sure, I'll start at the end. The money goes to the general account of the U.S. Treasury. It does not go back to NAGPRA. It doesn't go back to NAGPRA efforts. It goes to the general Treasury account, any funds that are collected. There are proposed changes to how penalties are calculated in the proposed rule. Right now, penalties are calculated as either a base amount or a percentage of a museum's budget, whichever is less. Right now, that's the way it's calculated. In our proposal from last summer, we suggested to just go with one amount, the base penalty amount. We received some good input from Indian tribes and the Native Hawaiian community on that proposal, and hope to have some adjustment within the proposed rule for how penalties can be calculated. In general, however, the goal of NAGPRA civil enforcement so far is to achieve repatriation. So it is not it's not an industry or a way to increase the treasury accounts. It is an effort to compel museums to repatriate. However, we do hope that by removing the limited ways in which a museum can fail to comply, as well as resetting this timeline, there may be more use for the civil penalties as a mechanism for enforcing compliance.
Right. The reason I ask that question is I know that hitting them where it hurts with their money seems to go a long way. And I worked on a piece of legislation in Colorado on the mascot bill, and we tied a fine if they did not change their mascot in a year's time. We told the schools that they had to pay a $25,000 fine until they changed it. So, and that got them moving. And so we were successful, where we've had over 20 schools then change their mascot. So I was just wondering if that was a possibility, right, to figure out a way to be forceful and hit them where it hurts, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. And we're going to wrap this up. We really appreciate your time. Thank you, all your Zoomers. Sorry we're unable to get to everybody's questions.